We are in Exodus chapter 13 this morning, so we have just finished chapter 12. We spent 3 weeks on chapter 12. We're going to spend 1 week on chapter 13. We'll kind of pick up the pace a little bit here again. The events that we've just seen have involved, of course, the 10th plague on Egypt, in which the firstborn were basically wiped out across Egypt, with the exception of those who had the blood on their doorposts and on their lintel, and in their case, the death angel passed over, and the firstborn were protected. And that becomes the background for some of the instruction that we have here in chapter 13 about special attention and provision that is made for the firstborn in Israel, that you're probably familiar with, but we'll be seeing a little bit of that this morning. Then, of course, the children of Israel, middle of the night, on cue, knowing this day was going to come, rise up and leave Egypt in orderly fashion. And we were noting last week that at least the probable first location they reached was a place here, speculative location, but it seems to be in this general region, a place called Succoth, S-U-C-C-O-T-H. It's about 20 miles distant from where they seem to have been concentrated in the region of the Nile Delta. That appears to be what had been prearranged by Moses, probably as a rendezvous point. So the people of God are coming from a variety of places, not only in the Delta, but down probably to some degree in the more southern reaches of Egypt. We don't know how far south that may have gone, but it seems the first place they were all going to assemble as one great body would be there at that city, which is identified by that name. The lesson last week also pointed out that there were a lot of others that joined the bandwagon, you know. So this group that's called the mixed multitude or the mixed crowd, people who are not native Israelites, but who are nevertheless seizing the opportunity to get out of town with these who have been liberated from their slavery, do so. And they join in. They become a bit of a problem later, but we had instruction last week as to how they are to be viewed. And of course, the principal significance of that was that even these people who were not native Israelites were nevertheless welcomed into the community. There was no prejudice against them based on their ethnicity or race or any other such thing. The only requirement was that they would be willing to submit to the entrance requirements of being a member of the covenant community and to embrace the basic faith outlook of that community. And then on that basis, we're told that they should be regarded as natives in the land. And so that's really one of the more somewhat egalitarian principles that we'll find in the ancient world, and certainly it's set forth repeatedly and consistently throughout the Old Testament. So we were noting that in passing. And that brings us then to chapter 13. And I think we can probably make it through this chapter in pretty good order here. So let's go ahead and start. We're at chapter 13, beginning at verse 1, and we'll read initially down to verse 9, the Word of God. The Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me all the firstborn. Whatever is the first to open the womb among the Israelites of human beings and animals is mine." Moses said to the people, "Remember this day on which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, because the Lord brought you out from there by strength of hand. No leavened bread shall be eaten. Today in the month of Abib you are going out. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your ancestors to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep this observance in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a festival to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen in your possession, and no leaven shall be seen among you in all your territory. You shall tell your child on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. It shall serve for you as a sign on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead, so that the teaching of the Lord may be on your lips. For with a strong hand the Lord brought you out of Egypt. You shall keep this ordinance at its proper time from year to year. So you'll notice immediately this first paragraph is a little bit of a revisiting of the discussion of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And because we've talked about that in some detail, I'm going to move through it quite rapidly, so we'll be able to stay on a good pace here. But let's ask God's blessing on our reflection on this text, and we'll get underway. Father, we are grateful to you for your mercies to us, which are new every morning. We thank you for this beautiful place where we can come together as your people to crowd around your word and seek the wisdom that you have used to feed your people throughout the ages. And we pray that we now may also join them as those who have been nourished as we reflect on this instruction that comes to us through your word. We ask your blessing on us as we consider this text now. We ask these things in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, so the Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me all the firstborn." Brave young lady, come right up here. See, Kim is my faithful A student in the front row. There she is. Yeah, that's right. "Consecrate to me the firstborn. Whatever is first to open the womb among the Israelites of human beings and animals is mine." This is the inauguration of a practice which would continue throughout the Old Testament, and we actually see it in the New Testament, in which the firstborn, both of animals and of humans, in the community of Israel were given some kind of special or peculiar treatment and status. And the rationale for it was, as you can readily imagine, that as they were escaping Egypt, the firstborn were forfeit. The Egyptian firstborn, of course, died, both people and animals. And that would have applied as well to Israel, but for the fact that they protect themselves by this atoning sacrifice, the paschal lamb, and thus they are exempted from the judgment that would otherwise have befallen them. But the quid pro quo for that arrangement is, and since God is saying, those firstborn who you otherwise would have lost are mine in some peculiar way. They belong to me. They are going to be set apart and given some kind of special status, and you're going to acknowledge that throughout your practice as a people of God by bringing them to me. And you may recall that in the New Testament, even Jesus, when he was, newborn, we read about his circumcision in the Gospel of Luke, and then a few days later, we hear that Joseph and Mary brought Jesus to the temple for his dedication. And that's precisely what they were doing. They were following the Old Testament law that required that the firstborn be offered in some way, relinquished really, in some way to God. And then God would give this child back. There'd be, as it were, a redemption price paid. And based on that redemption, the child was returned, but returned in a sort of provisional sense to the parents. So they are going to rear this child for the Lord, as the Lord's possession. And that's kind of the mindset of the Old Testament attitude toward the firstborn. It all roots back then to this Exodus event. So we'll say more about that in a moment, because the chapter itself brings us back to that topic in a more extended discussion, but we'll move on from here. Moses said to the people, "Remember this day on which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, because the Lord brought you out from there by strength of hand. No leavened bread shall be eaten." So now we're returning to the instruction concerning the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We've talked about that in detail. I'm not going to go back through that because you all have great memories and recall it all very well. But there are a few little details that are new, and I want to focus on those. The first is this emphasis on remembering. We saw that before, but let's just remind ourselves how important it is to remember, That is at the heart of faithful Christian observance, is that we are not forgetful, we have good memories. There's a word that's used in the Bible, it's the word apostasy. That word is frequently associated with the word forgetfulness. That to forget what God has done brings me perilously close to wandering off into bad places. I'm supposed to recall what God has done. And that really, if there's any theme that's going to run through this chapter, we're going to see this revisited several times, that there's a remembering, and that's a discipline. It's not simply something we sort of hope happens in a kind of happenstance way. There should be devices that are intended to trigger our memories. For the children of Israel, they ate unleavened bread. You bite into that crunchy stuff, you think, oh, that's not tasting so good, and it reminds you of things, reminds you of the Exodus, reminds you of several days of having to eat unleavened bread because there was no time to prepare the provisions for the trip and so on. There's a recollection of those events. For us as Christians, we remember the Lord's death. When he says, do this in remembrance of me, we come to the Lord's table, and that should be framed in our minds. Christ died for my sins. I'm recalling that now. This little sacrament is bringing it back to my mind. I don't think there's anything wrong with Christian people having a little memory museum. I don't know about you. I've got a few little trinkets, that I've accumulated over the years. Little items. They wouldn't mean anything to you, but I look at them. A little rock, there's a little whistle, what a bunch of trash, you would say. But no, for me, those recall to my mind times when I really was aware God was doing something. And so it's a little kind of way of remembering those things. Not a bad idea to keep a journal, write down. It doesn't have to be extensive, doesn't have to be deeply introspective or some such thing. You don't have to write it like you expect it to be published someday, but something that reminds you, something that reminds me of how God has worked. I keep a little journal. And I tell you, it's always so much fun. I go back and look at the things that had me so stressed out 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And I tell you, I forget it was even a problem. And it's not like I can say, oh, God just miraculously intervened in life and fixed that problem. It usually doesn't happen that way. It's just you realize after a period of time, what seemed to be a crisis has become a non-issue. God has somehow, in his still, small, quiet, subtle way, accomplished things that seem so problematic at the time. Well, we have a tendency to forget. I don't know about you, I forget these things, and so these little notes to myself are useful. And of course, the very design of the sacramental system and the sacrificial system in the Scriptures has as one of its most pointed, calculated intentions to cause us to remember. So we notice that here. Remember this day when you came out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, and so on. Today, in the month of Abib, you are going out. Abib is the first month of the Jewish religious calendar. It begins about March 21st. We've talked about that before. It's a springtime month. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, and so on, which he swore to your ancestors to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep this observance in this month. Another little emphasis that we find here that was not quite so significant earlier was that there's a real point in saying to the people, this is something you are going to observe even when life is easy. When you are in a land flowing with milk and honey, you will still eat this unleavened bread. Even when life is good and you've got your flat screen TV and you've got your 2 cars in the garage and you've got, all of the good things that can come to you as an expression of the blessing that is going to be yours in a land flowing with milk and honey, you still need to have a little season of austerity, a little time when you restrict yourself, a time, as it were, of fasting, a time of just recalling that it wasn't always this way. And in some ways, that's a good reminder that it may not always be that way, that we are living in the bounty of God's blessing. God can give, God can withhold, and somehow we should be reminding ourselves of that. And so this unleavened bread becomes a reminder that there was a time when, it wasn't quite so enjoyable, so comfortable as it may be now. Even when you're in this land flowing with milk and honey, you'll do this. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the 7th day, there will be a festival to the Lord. We've talked about that before. I'll just bypass that. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen in your possession. Excuse me. No leaven shall be seen among you in all your territory. Excuse me. The territory, again, is a focus on the land that they are going to be occupying. It's a focus on the future. Even there, they're still going to have this observance of a time of eating unleavened bread. You shall tell your children on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. It's also interesting, of course, how frequently we are reminded to tell the children these things. And I know I've said this before, but every time the text kicks me, I have to say it, And so here it is again, tell your children. I see enough gray hair in the room, mine among them, that for some of us it's telling our grandchildren. But that's a very healthy thing to do. It's a very healthy thing to tell your grandchildren how God has worked in your life. It makes that grandchild feel that he or she is part of some bigger story. Kids come into this world with kind of a natural outlook that history all began with me. Isn't that true? You just think everything else is sort of in dusty textbooks, and really, it all starts with me. How significant is it to learn that the story of me is inextricably connected to a story of a parent and a story of a grandparent and maybe a great-grandparent, and that God's faithfulness in the lives of those people has actually been part of what produced me, and that I therefore can be grateful for God blessing me before I was ever a twinkle in anybody's eye. That's really helpful for a child to have that sense of the bigger picture. And so certainly we have that reminder again and again. You shall tell your children of these things. Verse 9, it shall serve as a sign on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead, so that the teaching of the Lord may be on your lips, for with a strong hand the Lord brought you out of Egypt. This reference to something on your head and something on your wrist is interesting. I think most of you know that people in the Orthodox tradition of the Jewish religion take that quite literally, quite seriously, and sometimes you'll see them, especially, for example, images you've seen of Jewish people praying at the Wailing Wall, there in Jerusalem, the Wailing Wall, the most holy remnant of the first century temple, and often they have this little box, don't they? You ever seen that strapped on their forehead or maybe on their hand? That box is called a phylactery, right? A little container. And inside it are little pieces of the law. If you open that box and looked in, you'd see little tiny pieces of paper having various parts of the content of God's law in there. And they take that, of course, quite seriously and quite literally. We in our Christian tradition have thought, well, we're not so sure that is the point, that we simply wear little boxes. We're not disparaging of that, and maybe it's a good idea. Maybe it'd be a good reminder in itself. But we have tended to take this as pointing to the fact that the life of faith is a life on the one hand of the mind and a life on the other hand of service. There is a cerebral aspect to being among the people of God. We are called to be students. We're called to study. We're called to learn. We're called to be involved in the educational process. You're here in Sunday school. It's good, I wish you had a better Sunday school teacher, but, so far this is what you're going to get. But you are all teachers too, aren't you? You are all in the business of instructing. You are all in the business of conveying information, because education creates ballast, creates stability. It prevents us, as the Apostle Paul says, from being blown around by every wind of doctrine. That kind of content is good for us. And it gives us the sort of weight and stability that we need in a world that's swirling with all kinds of weird ideas, So Christianity has been, and the Jewish faith has been, a religion of the mind. There are religions in the world that say that to get close to God, you need to empty your mind. You need to vacate your mind. You need to think about something that is going to have the effect of causing you to not think. Think about one hand clapping. I said that once in class, and of course some wise acre kid goes, one hand clapping, that's easy. Get out of here, kid, you bother me, But, well, what's that? What do you learn from that? The theory is that as you can empty your mind somehow in a non-rational way, in a sort of mystical communion, you can contact some higher, cosmic spirit or something like that. Well, we Christians don't operate that way. We believe that while there is a place for kind of mystical experience, there is a place for reflection and meditation. Fundamentally, the life of Christian growth involves, in part, educating the mind. But we also believe it involves service. We believe that if you're going to have a well-rounded Christian experience, you need to be serving somebody. There needs to be concrete expression of actual practical service in the life of your neighbor, in the life of your family member, in your church, in your community, that has been the calling card of legitimate Christianity all through the centuries. We don't just sit around in classrooms educating ourselves. There's, kind of the problem of somebody that eats all the time and doesn't labor gets a little plump. A person who labors all the time and doesn't eat gets emaciated. We need to take in, we need to give out. I'm telling you the obvious, but the text here suggests we should do that. Unfortunately, as I think you're aware, in modern Christian history, especially in the last century and a half or so, there's been kind of a dividing of the ways. And you do have almost two different perspectives. You have Christian people on the one hand who tend to be very interested in the Bible and Bible study and learning it and all of that, and I have to say that's kind of my bias personally. But they tend to be a little bit negligent when it comes to the business of service, And then there are others, of course, who are busy in doing service but may be neglecting the study of the Word. And that has sort of divided itself down lines that we sometimes call liberal and conservative, or more social gospel, and then evangelical. I think you're aware of that. You can pretty much trace that, at least in American Christianity, from the turn of the century and even a little bit earlier. Well, that's not healthy. We need to be doing both, Now, I'm preaching very much to the choir here in First Presbyterian. I hope in the best sense of the word, proud that we do both. I think we are really doing some good things on both fronts, and so my hat's off to the leadership in this church for helping us in that regard. But it has been a problem. I think you're aware of that. I love the book. I've mentioned it before, Richard Stearns. You've all read it. You've all been moved by it, which really does bridge the gap. It really does give us, I think, that helpful synthesis of those two. And certainly in the Old Testament here, we find it implied. So you shall keep this ordinance at its proper time from year to year. Next paragraph, the consecration of the firstborn, starting in verse 11. When the Lord has brought you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your ancestors, and has given it to you, you shall set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb. All the firstborn of your livestock that are males shall be the Lord's. But every firstborn donkey you shall redeem with a sheep. If you do not redeem it, you shall break its neck. Every firstborn male among your children you shall redeem. When in the future your child asks you, what does this mean? You shall answer, by strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn, human firstborn, to the firstborn of animals. Therefore, I sacrifice to the Lord every male that first opens the womb, but every firstborn of the sons I redeem. It shall serve as a sign on your hand and as an emblem on your forehead, that by strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. So this now is the first real institution of this practice that was continued and persisted all through Jewish history, of the consecration of the firstborn. When the Lord has brought you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your ancestors, you shall set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb, the firstborn. The firstborn of your livestock that are males shall be the Lord. So we start with a reflection on animals. Firstborn of animals, male, firstborn, were to be sacrificed. That was the basic principle. They brought the firstborn of the goats, the firstborn of the sheep, and so on. Clean animals, in other words, animals that were used in the sacrificial process, they were brought and they were simply offered. Because, the message being, that God already had them anyway. God had only preserved them in Egypt based on pure mercy, pure atonement had covered them. But now God in some sense owns them, and so they are brought and sacrificed. Now if the animal happens to be one that is not appropriate for sacrifice, a donkey, these are called unclean animals in the Old Testament. There were others, but by way of example, this one would not be offered because it wasn't appropriate for sacrifice, but a substitute would be given for it. So a sheep or goat or something would be brought in place of this one. And if you didn't want to do that, then it had to be eliminated. It had to be killed. So that gives the animal kind of arrangement, and then it moves to discussing firstborn children. Every firstborn male among your children you shall redeem. So the practice was the firstborn male in the family was brought to the temple and in a little ceremony was relinquished to Yahweh. This child is yours. In principle, it could have been the case that you just drop the kid off and take a leave, and then the temple is overrun with little kids. That did happen on one occasion, didn't it, in the Old Testament? Who is the child that was dropped off at the temple? And that was Samuel, right? Hannah, his mother, had prayed for a child, and her prayer appeared to go unanswered for so many years, and then finally when God did answer, she made good on a promise that she had already given, that she would actually dedicate this child, leaving it there at the temple. That was taking place in the context of this relinquishing of the firstborn. That's rare. Didn't usually happen that way. He's a kind of exception to the rule. I'm not sure how Eli felt about it, to become a full-time daycare, but that's the way it worked out. But anyway, usually what happened was you would bring the child, relinquish it to the Lord, and then buy it back. And there was a payment, a sacrificial payment that was made by which the child was restored to the parents. It was a graduated scale. If a person had means, then the payment would be a sheep or a goat. If they were poverty-stricken, then they could give, 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. That was the alternative. That was for those who were very, very poor. It's interesting that when Jesus was dedicated, Mary and Joseph come, and they offer that offering given by the poor. It speaks to how impoverished they were. They were royalty in Israel, but they had been reduced to impoverishment because of the tyranny that was in place at that time. But anyway, the child is brought. So what do we learn from this? Well, this became the paradigm for our understanding of what happens in Christian baptism, especially infant baptism. We, of course, with the vast majority of Christian practitioners in history, baptize infants. Even those who don't, more or less in the Baptist tradition, have a comparable practice called infant dedication. I grew up Baptist. I was dedicated as an infant, and then baptized later. But not that I'm objecting to that, but also I endorse what we do here as a Presbyterian church, that really it does, I think, fulfill even more richly what is intended in the text. The child is brought, if you pay attention to what the pastor is saying, of course, at an infant baptism, the child is brought, and at least part of what's being happening there is a dedication, a relinquishing of the child to the Lord. We believe it's more than that, but not less than that. We believe that there is a parental declaration, this child is the Lord's. And then the pastor says, okay, now we're giving the child back to you. But the child is given back on a provisional basis. It is still the Lord's. And you are simply acting as God's agent to care for God's child. It doesn't belong to you, finally. The child doesn't even belong to the state. Can you believe that? It belongs to God. and you are doing something on behalf of God, fulfilling your responsibility to rear this child with an understanding, you, child, belong to the Lord. You are the Lord's. You're not ours. You don't even belong to yourself. But God has purchased you. And that great idea of redemption, of buying back, is just, shot through this. You have been purchased. Blood has been shed. Your life has been redeemed based on mercy. And now, because God has bought you outright, you belong to Him. And that's part of the instruction we give to children, hopefully, as they grow, and they have some sense of that as they become more mature. So every child, every male of your children, of course, we expand that in the New Testament to all of the children, not the firstborn anymore, but the same principle is there. In the future, when your child asks you, what does this mean? You shall answer, by the strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. Children ask questions, and we should give answers. This is the way God has set things up. Children have a wonderful kind of curiosity about them, and we should be always there to fulfill that curious spirit of theirs and to answer those questions. And sometimes those questions will lead you into the most profound of philosophical speculation, but you should try to go there as best you can, as they endlessly keep asking, why? Why do you do this? Why that? So, when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land, human firstborn and the firstborn of animals. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord every male that first opens the womb, every firstborn of the sons I redeem. And our instruction then along those lines continues, I think, meaningfully for us. It'll serve as a sign on your hand, as an emblem on your forehead, that by strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. All right. That brings us to the last short paragraph, which now returns really to the story. So we've had all of this instruction, and now we pick up the actual movement. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was nearer. For God thought, if the people face war, they may change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people by the roundabout way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of the land of Egypt prepared for battle. And Moses took with him the bones of Joseph, who had required a solemn oath of the Israelites, saying, God will surely take notice of you, and then you must carry my bones with you from here. They set out from Succoth and camped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. The Lord went in front of them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them along the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, so that they might travel by day and by night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. Hence, the map is with us once again, so I hope you can see it back there past the first couple of rows. Let's look at this. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was nearer. For God thought, if they face war, they may change their minds, go back to Egypt. Well, I think you can see plainly enough what's going on. This is, where'd it go? There it is. This is where they've rendezvoused, and now they're heading toward the wilderness. And of course, they may have thought the shortest distance between 2 points of straight line, or at least a curved line in this case, that they would just kind of hug the Mediterranean coast and go right up into Canaan. That would certainly have been the most direct route, and at least they may have thought that that's what they would do. It's called on this map the way of the Philistines, or the way to the land of the Philistines. The Philistines actually occupied this region. These are the famous Philistine cities: Ashdod, Gaza, Raphia, the others are there. Ashkelon is there, and so on. Hard to say exactly who the Philistines were at this time. There's very widespread consensus that later the Philistine population was made up of people who were called the Sea People, which seem to have been sort of a mixed Nordic race that came down and incorporated Mycenaeans with them. But all of that was later in history. And so whoever these people were at this time in history, they may have been some of the Hyksos, we're not sure, but they seem to have been at least a warlike people that would have prevented, or at least presented an impediment to the progress of God's people going straight into Canaan. This, of course, doesn't even mention that God had other designs anyway. He wanted the people to go to Mount Sinai. He wanted them to worship at the mountain where God had said to Moses, "This shall be a sign to you that you're going to worship at this mountain." There has to be some preparation, some training. All of these things need to take place. These people are not by any means ready to just, go running into Canaan here. And so there were other plans in mind. So we're told initially they didn't go this way. Now, a little bit less clear is the next line. So God led the people by the roundabout way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. Now, there's two theories as to what that means. And you actually see on the map here, both are postulated. This one is called possible Exodus route. That, my friends, is the correct answer. This one is called traditional Exodus route. That, my friends, is the incorrect answer. Not that I have any strong opinions, but one is right, one is wrong. So let's just, get that on the table right here. The traditional Exodus route is based on the theory that Mount Sinai is at the tip of the Sinai Peninsula. I've talked about this before. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. You mostly, I think, were here at that time. But I think it's at least worth noting that the notion that Mount Sinai is at the tip of the Sinai Peninsula, while intuitively it makes sense because Sinai, we think on the face of it, it seems to make sense. Nevertheless, that idea was a purely Christian invention of the late 2nd century, which is simply to say no Jewish author, nor even any earlier Christian author, or even the New Testament, contemplates that Sinai is here. The Apostle Paul himself in Galatians says, Sinai in Arabia. This is Arabia. This is not Arabia. Paul envisions that Sinai is over here in what was some region of Midian or Arabia. That would have been, the meaning of that. But in about the year, say, 250, there were some Christian monks who were just kind of thinking, we need to go out into the wilderness and live very, very austere, ascetic lives, and wouldn't it be cool if we could do that near Mount Sinai? And without necessarily giving much scholarly consideration, they just kind of wandered down into this region and found a nice mountain and decided that must be Mount Sinai. And from that Christian tradition, this entire notion that that's Mount Sinai, where Moses received the Ten Commandments, is located. So I'm just saying there is almost overwhelming evidence against that. But it's been so commonly understood that even this map still has to allow for it as what's called the traditional Exodus route. It even that in that way kind of allows the sort of hesitation about whether that's really it. Much more likely is that the people of God headed out in a direction across the northern midsection of Sinai. This was a very commonly used trade route. It was the route that Moses himself must have used when he was escaping from Thutmose III, and it seems by far the most probable. So if that was a burning concern in your mind, now you've got that clarified. Another detail here that's a little bit more difficult is the reference to the term Red Sea. Some of you are familiar with this. You know the Hebrew behind that is the term Yam, Y-A-M, Suph, S-U-P-H, which literally means sea of reeds. So, and by the way, it's just a pure linguistic accident that the word red and the word reed are similar. That's an accident of translation. It's not anything in the original language, but we do have that little ambiguity. So you've got the term Yam Suph, sea of reeds, but the translation here puts Red Sea. And of course, the traditional understanding is that the people of God crossed the Red Sea. I don't want to do a lot with this right now. I just want to mention that we will return to this, but say this much on a preliminary basis about the question. First of all, there is no known Reed Sea in terms of ancient, references in Egyptian writings or otherwise. We know a lot of seas, a lot of lakes, a lot of ponds, a lot of rivers, a lot of bodies of water. There is never anything called the Sea of Reeds in Egyptian literature. This is purely a Hebraic expression, Yam Suf, referring to the Sea of Reeds. It is commonly thought by many that it must be some little body of water out here somewhere, probably fairly shallow, that had reeds growing out of it because it was so shallow, and that's where the chariots of Pharaoh got stuck, but the people of Israel were able to escape, and then later the story was greatly embellished into this dramatic Exodus account that we have in the book. That's a very common, somewhat liberal view of what's going on here. So that's out there, and we'll have to deal with that. The other thing I think we need to notice is this. There are occasions in the Old Testament where the term Yam Suf is used, in Psalms and elsewhere, especially, in fact, in connection with the life of Solomon. The term Yam Suf is used, and it clearly, everybody would agree, is referring to this body of water, the Gulf of Aqaba, which is part of the Red Sea. There were various seaports on that Gulf. Solomon, at a place called Eziam Gebar, established a kind of a naval port during his very successful reign, and it was said to be on the Red Sea, on Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, but clearly in that case it was referring to that body of water. So even though the term Sea of Reeds is unexpected, it does at least appear in the Old Testament to refer to that body of water. And that has led some to speculate, and some of you are familiar with this, that the actual Exodus crossing took place very dramatically right there at some point along what's called the Gulf of Aqaba. It's an open question. I'm not going to die on this hill either, but I want to at least sensitize you to what the questions are as we go along. So we'll leave it at that for now. We'll have to return to that at a later time. The Israelites went up out of the land of Egypt, prepared for battle. They go in battle array, but they're not really a prepared army. They're not ready to fight, but they kind of look military in their arrangement. Moses took with him the bones of Joseph, who required a solemn oath of the Israelites, saying, God will surely take notice of you, and then you must carry my bones with you from here. This is a wonderful detail. When Joseph died, years earlier, he'd given instruction, take my bones with you. Don't leave them in this mausoleum here in Egypt, as lovely as it is, as celebrated as it probably had become over time. I want my bones out of this place. I want you to take them up to this land that God has promised to our forefathers. That's where I want my final resting place to be. And it must have been richly meaningful to God's people to carry those bones with them. What a great sense of God making good on his promise, and of God, even in the case of Joseph, fulfilling the promise that he had made. Now, I hope I'm not pressing this point too far, but I want to put it this way. We, as God's people, need to be carrying the bones of those who have gone before with us. We need to carry those bones with us, because those bones of those who have gone before and prepared the way and made promises are richly encouraging to us. And part of our great sense of who we are is connected to those bones. There's a wonderful line in the book of Hebrews that says, concerning those who've gone before, the faithful who have died, it says of those people, though they are dead, they yet speak. Dead people still speaking. And those bones need to speak to us as we carry them along. There are the bones of people in your life that are still speaking to you, aren't there? I remember so well when I went to Whitworth 100 years ago, there was a wonderful philosophy professor there named Norman Krebs. He's now with the Lord. I had the opportunity to go to his memorial service probably 15, 20 years ago in Seattle, but he had such a powerful influence on my life. I'll tell you the truth. It was meeting Norman Krebs that actually convinced me for the first time in my life that you could both be a Presbyterian and a Christian. I mean, I grew up in such a narrow tradition, honestly, that if you weren't in that tradition, it was very, very suspicious. And I remember quite well growing up in that very narrow tradition that Presbyterians were just, there's not much hope for them, I mean, really, that was my impression when I was 13, 14, 15 years old. I went to Whitworth College, and I met Norman Krebs, a Presbyterian pastor turned college professor with his rich, wonderful, booming voice. I don't know if some of you may have actually met him along the way years ago. His deep insight and love of the Scriptures, his devotion to Christ, his concern for a young college kid like me, and I was changed. He's with the Lord, but I'm still carrying his bones with me. I still hear his rolling, wonderful voice in my head sometimes when I'm preparing a Sunday school lesson, wishing I could be like him, I carry his bones with me. You carry the bones of somebody with you, don't you? Most of you know my beloved mother who just went to be with the Lord within the last year. Don't you think I carry her bones with me? I've been hearing her voice since I was that big. I still hear her telling me, instructing me, correcting me, challenging me. Sometimes I wish she'd stop. Sometimes it's worse now than it was before, I'm carrying her bones with me. And there is that sense in which we carry a legacy with us. Yesterday I had the chance to teach out at Whitworth for 6 hours, a crash course in church history, which ain't so easy, let me tell you, just between you and me, but we just highlighted 4 great personalities in church history and tried to build the story of each of them, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Martin Luther, Karl Barth. Those were our 4 choices. There could have been any number of others, but those were the 4 we selected. And it was a wonderful opportunity to understand how we still carry the bones of Augustine with us. We still carry the bones of Luther or Calvin or all of these great saints who've gone before and courageously represented the truth of God. We should hear their voices in our minds and feel the weight of their great challenge before us. So anyway, it's a great reminder, and I think to the people of God it must have been very encouraging to have that privilege of carrying those bones with them. They set out from Succoth, we've said is right here, and camped at Etham. Nobody knows where that is. It seems to have been somewhat east of their present location on the edge of the wilderness. The phrase, the edge of the wilderness, suggests right at the edge of the Sinai wilderness. That would be the way that's commonly understood. On the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went in front of them with a pillar of cloud by day to lead them along the way, pillar of fire by night. This is the first introduction of those great images of theophany. A theophany is a visible expression of the presence of God that we find Older New Testament commonly thought of in the Old Testament. The most standard common theophanies are a pillar of fire or a pillar of cloud. And this is where they're really introduced. They're hinted at earlier. Genesis 15, you see a hint in the burning oven and the smoking furnace there. You see it. But here's the first time it's really introduced. Some of you may have been in the class that Jim Edwards taught here some years back, I think about 3 years ago, in which he dealt with the topic of being overshadowed. And he talked about how in the Old and New Testaments, that image of being overshadowed is a rich and redemptive idea of God's presence to protect us, guide us, watch over, and care for us. And he built it off of the Transfiguration account in the New Testament, but he went back and did just a brilliant assessment of this throughout the Scriptures. And I didn't hear it personally, I heard the tape of it, and it was just wonderful. Well, this is one of those texts where we begin to see this. The cloud in the daytime, many commentators would say, would have the effect of a cooling effect. It would be a shade against the blistering heat of the desert. But as you know, in the desert, the temperatures can drop precipitously, rapidly. So while it's so hot in the daytime, it can be freezing at night. And the pillar of fire at night all of a sudden becomes a source of warmth, you know. And that just is part of what's happening. It's leading them, guiding them. It's that visible presence of God that guides them along the way. And we are to understand that we are under that overshadowing presence of God. We may not see it, but it's there. And we are supposed to take by faith the reality that as we move through life, there's a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire that are guiding us along the way and insulating us from the ravages of the world, the flesh, and the devil, and other enemies mounted against us, and giving us that kind of care and protection. Revelation chapter 7 says, I will spread my tent over them. I will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And that image is wonderfully descriptive of really how the church is to be understood as a place of God's care and protection. And I believe that brings us to the end of the chapter and to the end of my comments.